Okay, so finding new audiences. So as Arnaud was saying, for those of you who are not very familiar with my research and what I do, I'm originally an historian, weaponed because of his interest in internationalist ideas in the interwar period to start working on Keynes. And what I'm doing here at UIS is to transform my PhD into a book. I'm working on a book manuscript, which will be published by Routledge, which was supposed to be published by Routledge last year. And yes, the book will cover basically the reception of the entirety of Keynes's writings from the economic consequences of the peace, his bestseller book on reparations, German reparations of 1919, up to the Bretton Woods discussions and a short conclusion on the legacy Keynes left in France in terms of economic theory and policy. And what I'm bringing here today for this talk, it's basically, we'll focus mostly on the 30s and the 40s, but I want to focus not so much on economic, let's say, pure economic theory questions, but more on how ideas are disseminated and the contexts and the mechanisms that permit for ideas to circulate. And there are basically three main aspects which we'll have to keep in mind. One is always the importance of political and economic contexts. The second are editorial networks and publishing networks. And the third is actually academic mobility, transnational academic mobility. And this is an excerpt from Keynes's obituary of Alfred Marshall from 1924, and it really encapsulates how we approached economic theory in the constant focus that he put on economic and political social contexts. And above all, to the awareness, the sheer awareness that these contexts are ever evolving, ever changing. And these, including in France, made his contemporaries sometimes very suspicious of Keynes, of his constant changing of mind. But as you used to say, when facts changed, so he changed his ideas. So this is just, I usually forget to put a picture of Keynes on my presentations. So for those who never saw Keynes, here he is, still young Keynes, Keynes from around 1919, 1920. So as I was saying, the objective of the presentation will be to study how Keynes' ideas were received in France and to study this interplay, the interplay between policy debates, editorial networks, and academic mobility. The hypothesis is basically to give you a background on the state of the art. Most historians, when they want to tackle French reception of Keynes, they usually draw on a very old article by Pierre Rosanvallon. Basically wrote in 1987 that Keynes was absolutely ignored during interwar France, during the 20s and the 30s, but then that after 45, France became paradoxically very Keynesian, almost as by magic. And of course, there's plenty of historiographic water that has passed under the bridge. There has been so much more literature that has been added meanwhile by Alain Berrose here with us, by Alain Alcouf, by Richard Arena, Anna Marisic. But amongst historians, especially economic historians, and those historians trying to analyze post-1945 economic planning in France, the Rosanvallon thesis always comes back. And what my research tries to do, and what this presentation, this talk will likewise contribute to, is to problematize that and relativize that narrative. I want to relativize it a little bit. And by showing that, in fact, in France, during Keynes' lifetime, his policy ideas were discussed and his writings were published. publishing and the circulation of ideas, of course, is not the same as impact, is not the same as acceptance. But then there is one thing that I want in particular to underline is already before World War II, the general theory was being discussed in France. And here, rather than some kind of magic that happened after 45, what happened was a phenomenon which was very similar to what happened in Britain and the US. And that means that the younger generation of economists start tackling the general theory. And you're doing it for several reasons, amongst which was the depth of the Great Depression, the prolonged economic crisis, but also because they're going to England, or they're getting in touch with people who are coming from England who had been in Cambridge, in Oxford, or in London. And this is a phenomenon which is fairly little studied. The academic mobility of French economic students into to England. There are a few cases which I found, but in general, we still don't know how many, probably little number. We're talking about little numbers, but it's an interesting topic of study. Anyway, there are two idiosyncrasies to the French context, which should be underlined. One is fairly unanimous belief on the gold standard. And the second is the political radicalization that followed the Popular Front. And this affected economists. And it's one of the reasons behind famous predecessors of neoliberal ideas like the Walter Lippmann colloquium. So the presentation will be structured in three parts, very French, in a very French way. So first part is just a preliminary brief introduction to how Keynes made it to France, how his ideas started being discussed. I'll talk very briefly about reparations. Then I'll focus on the gold standard, and I'll focus in particular in the role played by Paul Frank. Was Keynes's political and editorial agent from 1920 to 1926. And he played a role in Keynes's life that amongst other Frenchmen, there is no comparison whatsoever. Second part really focus on the most important years of the Great Depression, 1930, 1935. Once the Great Depression really spread towards the whole of Europe, Latin America, and also the period in which Keynes was, let's say, the most isolated in France, when Keynes was read and he sold newspaper articles, he sold books, but he met no support amongst either civil servants or economists. So that's to be the period between the Treatise on Money and the 1936 general theory of employment, interest, and money. And then finally, the last part focuses more on the general theory, on how these younger economists start reading the book, how it was translated by a civil servant called Jean-Hugues Largentet, how in one of the Popular Front governments, Pierre Mendès France and Georges Boris tried to make some use of Keynes' ideas. And then we also look very briefly into how the book continued to be read during the war and what happened after Keynes' death in 1946. Okay, so I suppose just to check, you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, because I was finding everything very silent. Okay, so the book that made Keynes an international celebrity is, of course, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which is condemnation of the Versailles Treaty. It was a book that was very, very critical of French foreign policy, but still it was published by the most important French publisher, at least the most prestigious from a literary viewpoint, publisher of the time, which was the Nouvelle Revue Française, the NRF, of Gaston Gallimard and André Gide. Now, to put it very briefly, the book only got published in France because Frenchmen were not as unanimous on how the peace of 1919 should be done than it's usually believed. Amongst economists, amongst the socialists, among pacifists, their viewpoints were similar to Keynes, that to some degree, either the treaty was a revenge piece on Germany, or simply it tried to make Germany pay without letting her do commerce, without allowing her to trade freely. And then these arguments, either pacifism or a free trade argument, essentially brought some of the major economists of the time, like Charles Gide and Charles Rist, but also various socialists and pacifists to support Keynes. And this is very interesting because Keynes' own networks touched both those groups. Keynes is usually believed as some sort of Germanophile, but he actually, through the famous Bloomsbury group of Virginia Woolf and Bertrand Russell, Leonard Woolf as well, actually possessed very deep links with France. Keynes, of course, was a collector of post-impressionist French painting, and he came to France regularly. And during the wars, he was in touch with the French inspectors of finance from the Treasury. So once the war ended and once Keynes published his book, he relied on these networks to publish the book. And this included, for instance, using Bloomsbury to get in touch with André Gide, who was one of the founders of the NRF, and as well talking or writing to Charles Gide, was the editor of the main French economics journal of the time, the Revue d'économie politique. And here, Charles Gide was responsible for also finding a translator for Keynes's book. And this translator was very young, very bright, Jewish Paul Frank, who came from a well-to-do bourgeois family involved in the textile trade. Frank is a very idiosyncratic case because he was 19-year-old Frenchman who spoke, let's say, almost or wrote and spoke very good English, which was not very common at the time, especially at such a young age. Above all, after Keynes basically broke relations with NRF, Paul Frank became his main contact in France. Keynes also had a long-time correspondent, Marcel Labordère, who's very famous, and Robert Skidelsky, the famous biographer of Keynes, has written plenty about Labordère, but Labordère never played a role in disseminating Keynes' ideas. Paul Frank, yes. Paul Frank did. Anyway, Keynes soon broke relations with the Nouvelle Revue Française because he believed they were for political reasons preventing his book from actually being widely sold. The truth is something is a bit more nuanced. We can talk about that in the debate, but the point that I want really to focus is exactly on Paul Frank, on his role as Keynes's eyes in France. Because at this stage, the reparations question was very intensely debated. There were international conferences, one after the other. There were political crises between the allies, the victors, France, Germany, France, England, and the US, or France and England above all. The US was in relative isolation against Germany. So Keynes was always publishing articles, newspaper articles that were basically updating the arguments of the economic consequences of the peace according to these changing political and economic contexts. And Paul Frank was the man responsible in France for doing very simple things, translating these newspaper articles, of which he translated dozens, negotiating with newspapers to get them published fully instead of just some abstracts, of sending Keynes what political commentary there was in France about these articles. He also went to negotiate with publishers for his books. Keynes would send him tables of contents, and Frank would then negotiate. And Frank translated it and was responsible for the publishing of 3 books overall by Keynes, not only the economic consequences of the peace, but the revision of the treaty, which was basically a sequel to the economic consequences, and then Tract on Monetary Reform, which was the second of Keynes's books, more or less strictly on economic and monetary issues. There was, Keynes had published another one before the war, but on Indian currency, which was basically a commentary on the quantitative theory of money, but that was never published in French, sorry. That was never translated during his lifetime to French. So the later of these books, the Tract on Monetary Reform, was published in English in England in 1923. It appeared in France in 1924, the year afterwards. In 1924 was one of the crucial years for the story of how Keynes' ideas made it to France, were disseminated in France. There are 3 major years. There's 1920, the economic consequence of the peace, 1924, and then later read 1936. So 1924 is so important because it was the year of the Dawes Plan. Basically, it was a reparations agreement backed by the United States, which by allowing Germany to borrow from the US, it allowed it to pay reparations and put a temporary end to reparations conflicts. This is a very synthetic and very brief, but just to give you an idea. The most important thing for our narrative is that the Dawes Plan pacified not only Franco-German relations, but European international relations. For a while, until 1928-29, reparations were no longer in the first pages of newspapers every 2 weeks. This means that policymakers could start moving and focusing on other aspects, on other inheritances from the war, which had not yet been solved. And one of these was international monetary stability. Because before the war, there was something called the gold standard, by which every currency was pegged, or as the value of each currency was determined by an amount of gold. And this allowed countries would keep fixed exchange rates, and this allowed for currencies to be easily exchanged. And of course, this scenario, which was backed by relative political stability, allowed for trade to grow and flow. And with the war put an end to all of this, countries basically constituted blocks that fought one another. And now policymakers are trying to restore this ideal paradisical scenario. And Keynes started moving as well his attention towards those problems, especially because Britain was traversing an economic crisis already after the war. Okay. One of the big debates in France, which Keynes contributed to with that book, La Réforme monétaire, was what to do with the public debt inherited by the war. Because to finance the war, countries had borrowed not only abroad, like France did from the US and England, but also from their own citizens, and thus creating a massive public debt. So how to get rid of the worst public debt, how to balance the budget, how to finance reconstruction. And Keynes, like French economists, and they were at one on this, stood for devaluation, because devaluing the franc would allow to abate the value of those internal debts, those domestic debts, start over again. Keynes went further than French economists, however, because already at the time he was talking about the euthanasia of the rentiers, of the public debt holders. And here it's interesting because Keynes had a very vague and some would say today historically inaccurate definition of the rentiers. Because for Keynes, the rentier was always the wealthy or the upper middle class. While in fact, in France, like as in Germany, the lower middle classes with fixed incomes also had invested their savings on on public debt, on state bonds. And here, Keynes basically saw devaluation as a way to swipe the rentiers, an easy way out. We could put it like this, but simplifying a little bit. French economists also wanted to devaluate the franc, but they also wanted to increase indirect taxation rather than direct taxation. Of course, indirect taxation is heavier on the working classes and the lower classes than on the upper ones. The importance of this little detour, it's at this stage between 1924 and 1926 that we start seeing the first, let's say, more hostile reviews from French economists to Keynes, because until now there are some voices of dissonance, but the major economists of the time, Charles Regis, Charles Rist, they were with Keynes on reparations. They supported Keynes on reparations, and they actually saw his writings on reparations as a vindication of their own positions, because academic economists had not been heard when the Treaty of Versailles had been negotiated. But now this starts changing, and Keynes was starting to be seen as a sort of heterodox, inflationist kind of figure. And there was one very interesting criticism by Bertrand Nogareau, was another of the big academic economists of the time, who, commenting on these proposals of Keynes for doing an euthanasia of the rentiers, basically commented that it was very strange to see an economist deriving policy advice not from the sound theory, from sound theoretical principles, but from economic circumstances, from economic contexts. And here we already see this widening gap on how to approach economics and how to produce economic advice. So this intellectual gulf continued to widen and widen and widen and widen in the late 20s. Once in 1928, France returned to the gold standard, Keynes was a very strong critic of the French monetary stabilization. France basically returned, I'd say, unofficially in 1926, but in 1928, through a monetary stabilization law, then officially returned to gold. And Keynes, of course, was a major critic of the gold standard already since 1924, which he saw as a barbarous relic, something that prevented monetary autonomy, prevented central banks from achieving price stability, which Keynes believed that if prices were stable, then production could flow easily because people had some degree of certainty about the future. French economists, either for theoretical or for practical reasons, and again, I'm simplifying a little bit here, but usually tend to see gold as an automatic regulator of economic life. The scheme was simple, was if you overborrow, if you overprint money, then your currency will lose its value, your central bank will lose its gold, and then eventually your money will be so worthless that your exports will be stimulated. Of course, there's a big debate in France against the quantity theory and against this notion, but even economists who did not see gold as an automatic regulator of economic life, people like Nogareau, Aftalion, they endorsed the gold standard for practical reasons, for reasons such as that the French public expected psychologically the gold standard to exist because it was synonymous with monetary stabilization. Anyway, it was at this stage that Keynes started making his critique that France was so bent on accumulating gold that it would transmit deflation to other countries. And this, of course, is nowadays fairly mainstream economic history conclusion on the causes and the consequences of the Great Depression. Anyway, I'm not so interested on the exact aspects of Keynes' theory, but more on how it permitted, it enhanced its distance from French economists on intellectual on the intellectual or ideational causes of the Great Depression. So this means that once the Great Depression starts in 1928, then it quickly propagates from 1930 onwards. Once the Great Depression starts, Keynes was already isolated from an ideational point of view in terms of economic theory and policy from French economists and from civil servants as well. And one of the most famous, of course, was Jacques Rueff, who had already became famous for his view that for the British unemployment crisis was in great part caused by unemployment allowances. Anyway, most important thing is that this idea of Keynes as an inflationist is already gaining ground. And this is clearly observable in the conservative press, the mainstream conservative press. Another factor which contributed to Keynes' isolation was that his eyes on France, the person who was in charge of taking care of his interests in France, died in 1926. And this was a major blow to Keynes. Because Frank, as Frank was a young man, was using Keynes' ideas to try to make a political career for himself. He was meeting Keynes in England. They were discussing very closely where to publish, how to publish. I was providing him with just general commentary on the latest gossip of French politics. He was a very bright young man. He was supposed to be teaching at the École d'études sociales, but then he died in 1926, in September 1926, in very strange circumstances, most probably from suicide. And Keynes actually struggled very much to publish his books ever since. During his lifetime, every book that he tried to publish always had a very convoluted story. So what Keynes did was actually to rely either on the networks that Frank had already established. So for instance, one of the first book that he published after Frank's death appeared in the same publisher of La Réforme monétaire, the Édition de Sagittaire. This was a book called Réflexions sur les francs. Réflexions sur les francs, in fact, was something like the essays on persuasion, which I'll talk about, an anthology of collected writings. But above all, Keynes relied on people coming to him. He started moving also his focus less towards international matters and more towards economic theory and British problems. And he started relying on newspaper editors coming to him and saying, well, your writing, your newspaper writing, your articles are selling, and we are interested in publishing you. You have something for us. And this happened regularly, very regularly. And what happens is that Keynes actually, as we'll see further, had continued to publish, even if his ideas were not accepted, let's say, but they still raised, as Keynes like to say, raised the dust. They were still controversial. Because Keynes had gained a reputation for prophecy and controversy. He was always known for as the prophesizer, the prophet of doom. And people would actually say, what will Keynes say? There is a famous anecdote from right before once the 1924 Dawes Plan was announced, that French civil servants were saying to each other, what will Keynes say? And newspaper editors bet on this to keep publishing Keynes. And that takes us to the second part of the presentation. Second part of presentation on those years from the Treatise on money to the 1936 general theory. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of how French economists tackled Keynes during the years of the Great Depression is that there was a general rejection of the idea that the crisis could be solved by monetary methods. And for where French economics at the time, French monetary economics of the time remained fairly, they're not very well studied. We have little little historical studies made on that subject. But basically, there were the metalists who defended the idea of metal money, of gold standard, and they saw as an heresy the idea of Keynes that you could reflate the economy by leaving the gold standard. For them, money was gold. So tampering with the gold standard was a taboo. At the same time, even for economists with what we usually call the word nominalists, a nominalist conception of money, they tended to see the gold standard basically as an expression of the lawful willingness of the state to peg the money to gold, again, for psychological reasons. So they're always very wary of this idea of leaving the gold standard. But the general perception, even amongst, not only amongst economists, but even in the financial press, which is something that I give plenty of attention in my work, the financial press, was that, well, there's no remedy for the crisis because it does not exist. The crisis had been caused by overinvestment, by overborrowing from banks that were creating too much credit. And so the consequence, the only remedy possible was retrenchment, fiscal retrenchment, deflation. Let's get rid of these useless enterprises that do not produce any economic value, and let's start over again. Now, where French economists were saying this, Keynes was literally advancing all sorts of remedies that will be considered heresies. The redistribution of gold reserves amongst all countries on the gold standard as a way to allow countries to start some counter-cyclical policies like public works, leaving the gold standard, to lower interest rates, to buy government, for central banks to buy government securities as a means to put money in the economy. Keynes even advocated protectionism before Britain finally left the gold standard in September 1931. And all of these ideas, or the basis, the theoretical basis of these ideas, appeared on Treatise of Money, which was a very long book of nearly 800 pages in 2 volumes, and which took Keynes a very long time to write, from 1924 to 1930, at the time when he was extremely involved as a public intellectual. Constantly providing newspaper articles, directing a newspaper, participating as an advisor in governmental committees, expert committees. So let's say it's not the most systematic of the books of the economic treatises. And it's a book that still continues to be a challenging read, at least to read from the start to the end. Now, one of the things of Keynes, though, is that he rightly predicted that once Britain leave the gold standard and regain monetary autonomy, the British economy will start recovering. And Britain indeed eventually left the gold in September 1931. And this is important. Keynes was very optimistic, but this was important because until now Keynes only focused on how if you lowered interest rates, if you allow credit to be offered more cheaply to businesses, then the economy will reflate and the crisis will go away. And what actually happened after Britain left gold was that, yes, it did recover, but not as people expected. And it was at this stage that Keynes started realizing that maybe just monetary tools will not be sufficient to end unemployment, that you have to some degree, or you have to basically justify for public investment. And he set to build an economic theory that precisely allowed that. But let's hear Keynes talking about why after Britain will leave gold, everything will turn out all right. This is very interesting. It's one of arguably the only footage that we have of Keynes in the 30s.
There really seems to be some providence which watches over this country. 2 months ago, we were in an impossible position. For years past, our industry had been strangled by the exchange value of our money being too high, with the inevitable result that the cost of our goods was also too high for foreign markets. But how on earth were we to get loose in an honorable way? For our bankers, who had accepted foreign money at a high exchange value, felt that it would be wrong for us to change the value of our money voluntarily. As events have turned out, the change has been forced on us under circumstances extraordinarily fortunate and favorable. We have nothing to fear, honestly nothing. So often, in the past 10 years, I have had to prophesy evil. But now, a great weight is lifted from us, a great tension relieved. There's no danger of the exchange falling too far. There's no danger of a serious rise in the cost of living. The worst I should expect would be a return to the prices of some 2 years ago. But meanwhile, British trade will have received an enormous stimulus, much more than most of us have yet realized. It is a wonderful thing for our businessmen and our manufacturers and our unemployed to taste hope again. But they must not allow anyone to put them back in the gold cage where they have been pining their hearts out all these years.
All right, so Keynes and then the hill climb. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to move slides. Echo. So this was Keynes on Britain leaving the gold standard. At the same time, France, of course, at this stage, as we'll talk further ahead, continued on gold, and it will eventually be largely isolated in 1931. Britain left September 1931, and then 1933, after Franklin Roosevelt came to power, France was basically left alone with Belgium and the Netherlands on gold. And the result eventually was that its exports became too expensive, and the economic crisis finally hit France greatly. But we'll come to that later on. I would like to go back to the Treatise on Money. So Keynes, the book, as I was saying, was very large, 2 volumes, nearly 800 pages. And the book appears at the point when Anglo-French relations were at a very low level, especially because between civil servants from the Treasury and the Bank of England and those from the Bank of France and the French Treasury, because of course the English officials were accusing the French of conducting a monetary policy that was taking gold away from England and was forcing England to raise its interest rates at the time when England was in Britain was in very acute economic crisis with large unemployment levels, and it needed as well for political reasons to actually do the opposite, to lower interest rates. Anyway, that does not mean that civil servants were still not in touch with each other. And once Keynes published the Treatise on Money, well, he did not have Paul Frank anymore, and he tried to rely on the networks that he had available. And these were his networks within the English civil service. And there's a very interesting story about how Keynes actually contacted an advisor to Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, and he contacted one of Norman's advisors, which was Harry Zipman, and Harry Zipman was getting in regular touch with French officials, and one of these officials was Pierre Quenet. Pierre Quenet had been the head of economic research at the Banque de France, and one of the men, together with Charles Rist and Émile Moreau, especially Charles Rist, responsible for bringing France back to the world standard. Pierre Quenet at this stage was a general manager of the Bank for International Settlements, and actually Zipman and Keynes were trying to see who could translate the Treatise on Money in France. And they tried first a man called Marc Lavalette, who had published a couple of articles on Keynes' ideas, but then decided to contact Quenet. And Quenet actually said, well, there's a couple of officials at the Banque de France who could probably translate your book, because they've already translated books from English. One, however, knows little or no English, and but still is very competent in financial technique. And Keynes at the end decided not to proceed and contact these Bank of France officials, because there's no traces on his correspondence on his personal papers of why. But the question was that already beforehand, a year before, Keynes had tried to get an article on French monetary policy from the Bank of France officials, and the governor had actually refused. So that probably played a role in convincing Keynes not to go further ahead. Also, because already at this stage, 1931, the Treatise on Money, as I said, was not the most systematic of the books. Keynes, his attention divided between multiple tasks while he was writing it, and the book received very usually strong and negative reviews from other economists. And this convinced him to rethink everything again, and it put him on the path that led to the general theory. And as an anecdote, the book was only translated in 2019 by an economist called Marc Laudet. But at the same time, and I like to emphasize this, Keynes was indeed walking on the wild side, in the sense that he was alone, okay? That there were no major figures endorsing his ideas in France. There is one exception, I'll talk further at, but still at the same time, once more, this does not mean that his books, his writings did not sell. And there are a couple of instances which show this. One is that he was still publishing on very prestigious newspapers and reviews. One of these was L'Information Financière, which was one of the major, if not the major, financial newspaper of the time. And the other was L'Europe Nouvelle, which was a journal specialized on international affairs, a bit like Le Monde Diplomatique or Le Courrier International of nowadays. And L'Europe Nouvelle, for instance, even received funds, was partly subventioned by the Quai d'Orsay, by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At the same time, there was wider public demand for Keynes's writings, and there was so enough public demand that Keynes managed to publish another anthology of economic writings and political writings at Nouvelle Revue Française. And this is an interesting story, which again shows the importance of networks. The translator was Herbert Jacobi, was a friend of the late Paul Frank. Was a socialist journalist at Le Populaire for many years, and basically contacted Keynes out of the blue, proposing his services to translate and find a publishing deal for the essays on persuasion, in exchange, of course, for a fee. Keynes agreed, had nothing to lose, and eventually Jacobi managed to get the book published by the Nouvelle Revue Française. And the anecdote, of course, is that Jacobi eventually started a new career as a major cabaret impresario, entrepreneur in New York after 1938. Indeed, one of the major figures of the New York cabaret scene after 45. Just before we move to the general theory, there's one aspect which is worth underlining here, and it's because I talked mainly about economists, briefly about conservatives, but one of the most interesting aspects that even among socialists, Keynes was not entirely popular, especially amongst socialist economists. Mostly drew their ideas from Marx or from vulgarizations of Marx. And socialists consistently saw planning, and there's plenty of discussions about planning as an alternative to devaluation, monetary manipulations. They're not alone in doing this. Even non-socialist advocacy of planning made the same relation, as in planning as an alternative to what they call monetary manipulations. The socialists, however, partly the theoretical explanation is partly based on their uses of Marx and the Marxian idea that true money is always gold, but also because they feared a repetition of German hyperinflation and they feared an increase in the cost of living of the working classes. Instead, if you nationalize the Bank of France, they believe, if you nationalize credit, if you put in place quantitative and qualitative controls, then there will be no problems regardless of the gold standard. Now, the interesting thing is that there are two interesting points. One is that only Georges Boris, I'll talk about him later on, stood for Keynes. And Georges Boris was an advisor or a friend of Leon Blum and was later on one of the men responsible for introducing general theory in France. And the second was actually that Keynes refused to collaborate and give advice to the Popular Front when the negotiations for the constitution of the Popular Front coalition started. Keynes was contacted by one of its representatives, man in charge of the trade union of public employees, of socialist civil servants, and Keynes basically refused to collaborate because the Popular Front's program refused to acknowledge the need for devaluation, for taking the France up to the gold standard. And again, to underline the importance of networks was that Keynes was put in contact with his Popular Front official because this man, François Walter, knew Quentin Bell, was the son of Vanessa Bell, a very close friend of Keynes, and the nephew of Virginia Woolf. So again, it was Bloomsbury working even after so many years. And this, of course, takes us to the last part of the presentation, which is a general theory and its impact in France. Now, general theory was published in another very important year for narrative. So really remember that I talked about 1920, the economic consequences of the peace, 1924, and now 1936. And 1936 was indeed a very important year, not only for Keynes, but for France as well. February, we have the publishing of Keynes' General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, finished in January, published in February. In May, the Popular Front won the elections. So it was basically the first, although it was a Republican coalition, it was arguably the first socialist government in France. October, France finally left gold. And also, I forgot to put it there, but we have the start of the Spanish Civil War, which is very, very important for the years to come, in the way that the dichotomy, the Popular Front and the Spanish Civil War, and the fear of communism amongst conservatives, including amongst economists, played a very important role even in structuring the reception of Keynes. But more importantly, the fact that Keynes had finally published his theory justifying not only for monetary intervention, but for an activist monetary policy, but also justifying public investment in the economy, that he published a theory justifying these things, these aspects, at a time when France left gold and regained to a degree its monetary autonomy, meant that French discussions of Keynes went from being something purely theoretical to something that at least corresponded to a scenario where they could be applied. Because until then, for instance, discussions of Keynes or even of Swedish proto-Keynesian, let's put it like this, theory would always emphasize that, well, France could not leave the gold standard for psychological reasons. Anyway, I put here a little slide on the 1936 general theory because it will be on its basic, very, very, very basic ideas. The economists will not here present in this presentation, in this talk, will not be impressed, but it's just a general introduction for those who are not economists or are not familiar with Keynes's ideas. So the basic idea of the book, consists on the notion of effective demand, okay? That income and employment are determined by the demand for consumer and consumption goods. So if demand falls below the income that businessmen expect to receive in the future, then they'll cut down on their production, on their investment. They'll put people in unemployment, they'll lay off workers, and then the economy will enter into a downturn, or the deflationary cycle. And the result will be that income will be reduced to the entire community. And then underlying this basic narrative, of course, it's Keynes's idea that decisions to invest and save are not made by the same people, but by different people. They are uncoordinated. And this is one of the reasons why the economy can rest or can be under full employment for a very long time. So, unlike most economists of the time, and not only French, unlike virtually 90 to 95% of the economists of the time, Keynes denied that saving was the engine of the economy. And this is very well expressed in the dog metaphor, which actually I took from Robert Skidelsky, just for the sake of clarity, in which, in neoclassical theory, a dog named savings waves a tail named investment. Well, in Keynes, the dog is actually called investments, and the little tail is savings. So the causality basically goes from investment to savings in Keynes's theory rather than the opposite. Now, one of the aspects that I'd like to underline is that it's very common in the scholarship in the history of economic thought and rightly so, to emphasize that many aspects of Keynes's theory had already been anticipated beforehand, and above all, that Keynes's set of policies, of favored policies, so activist monetary policy, low interest rates, open market operations, and public investment in the economy, public works, were already fairly common amongst economists. Problem is, this consensus did not exist in France. Economists were very divided on these issues. They were very skeptical about an activist monetary policy, and there were very few of them who actually stood for or even conceived of public works. People like Jean Lescoux and Albert Aftalion, but very timidly, very, very timidly. Regardless of this, or better, not regardless, but it's because of this that this generational change in French economics, these new, younger economists that basically reach adult scientific age, while France was entering to a period of economic crisis inherited after the Great Depression and deepened by the experience of the Popular Front. It became very important that they got in touch with Keynes's general theory precisely at this moment. And besides the political and cultural climate of the time, political, economic, cultural climate of the time, the other important aspect was, of course, academic mobility, which played a very important role, not only in allowing Keynes's theory to make it to France, but also for the first Anglo-American interpretations, third-party interpretations of Keynes's general theory to make it to France, what we nowadays call Keynesian theory. So there are two, in the late 30s, so it's my thesis that already by the late 30s, the book was circulating in France, the general theory was circulating in France. And there are two main paths, two main ways by which the book arrived. And one was through civil servants, especially socially civil servants or close or willing to support the Popular Front. And the second was indeed these younger economists. So in the first case, the story was already known to a degree, and what I did in my research was actually to go deeper and try to find these sources and make the narrative more clear. But basically what happened was that once the first Léon Blum government of June 1936, June 1937 failed in actually taking France out of the crisis, because Blum took France out of gold too late. That was one of the major reasons. But there was an effort from those civil servants who were close to Popular Front to do a rethink. Why did we fail? And it was at this stage that some of them start reading Keynes' general theory. And one of them, it was not only one, but one of them was a man called Jean-Rius de l'Argentais, who actually, as well studied by Ghislain de Laplace, who actually came to the book firstly because he had to, for reasons of work, because there had been a question from an MP, from a deputy, from a parliamentary figure on when exactly the printing money will increase prices, when exactly, where is the threshold between printing money and inflation. But what I want to underline here is exactly this, that there were this group of civil servants who start meeting at Vincent Auriol's house. Vincent Auriol was the former Minister of Finance of Léon Blum, and they're discussing general theory. At the same time, so was Georges Boris, who so far had been one of, maybe perhaps the single Frenchman who actually, one of the few Frenchmen who read, non-economist Frenchman, who read the Treatise on Money and was actually supporting Keynes on the press. And the story, to put it very simple, is that once Léon Blum had a last shot at the government in April, May 1938, they tried, those civil servants, Georges Boris and Pierre Mendès France, they tried to put together a rearmament scheme, which basically was a combination of Germany's own autarkic experience of trying to use rearmament to create a full employment situation, with which on a theoretical level was inspired by Keynes. And this, even if this rearmament scheme was not at all implemented, because Blum eventually, this rearmament scheme inspired by general theory was defeated by the French Senate. But the important thing, again, is how this was one of the first instances in which Keynes' ideas were influential or influence, which is always it's always a dangerous word, but which impacted French economic policy. Now, the other aspect, which actually gives the title to the presentation, was finding new audiences, was of course these younger economists who are arriving to an adult scientific age and were part of transnational academic mobility between France and England in the late 30s. In the year, the story, the main responsible was actually Charles Rist. Charles Rist had begun as a supporter of Keynes' views on reparations, but became increasingly ever more skeptical and critical of Keynes. But Charles Rist, at the same time, was the prototype of the academic who is always willing to dialogue and to nurture younger students, even if they necessarily do not hold the same ideas as is. Charles Rist in 1933, with Rockefeller money, partly funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, created an institute which was probably amongst the first modern economic research institutes in France. And one of the links that he established was with the London School of Economics. And there was an interchange of ideas. Yes? Okay. There is an interchange of ideas, and the younger researchers who worked on the RIST went regularly to England. One of them was the famous Etienne Mantoux, the other was the equally famous Robert Marjolin. And so I'm putting the story a bit, making the story a bit brief, but basically Mantoux was very important thanks to his father, who was a well-known professor of English history, already an excellent knowledge of English. But Mantoux spread not only Lionel Robbins' defense of free trade, but also Hayek's own ideas. Mantou's thesis is basically on Hayek and used Hayek's concept of forced savings to combat Keynes. But Mantoux at the same time also wrote a very good review of the general theory, even if critical, very accurate in the way that it described Keynes' book review, and even helped L'Argentais with his translation of Keynes' economic jargon. At the same time, Robert Marjolin wrote probably the first PhD thesis, which really tried to use Keynes' frameworks. So liquidity preference, the marginal propensity to consume, marginal efficiency of capital, effective demand, etc. He was not the first to use the general theory on a PhD thesis. That was Robert Bordat. Was one of the first people in charge of the Pompidou Museum, actually. And then there's finally another aspect in which academic mobility played a key role, this is something that I'm trying to work on with Yann Giraud, who's present here today. And this was Gaël Fin. Gaël Fin was a former German financial attaché, former financial attaché to the French embassy in Berlin, who was in Cambridge into 1936, 1937. And he was actually suggested by Payot as a translator to the general theory, but for reasons probably because Keynes at the time became very ill, he basically had a succession of architects. He never came to
Guilherme, to interrupt you, but you have only a few minutes left.
Yes, thank you. I'm nearly the end. I think 5-10 more minutes. We started a little bit late, so I think I won't take you much longer.
Thank you.
Anyway, Gaël Fin translated not only one of the first, let's say, Keynesian textbooks, James Mead's Introduction to Economic Analysis. It was the man responsible for Samuelson's in economics, even translated Schumpeter as well. And again, he had been at Cambridge, and this shows the importance of academic mobility. So I had a little video about the general theory, about how Keynes, of course, as I was saying, this shows that his ideas were already circulating in France before 1939. At the same time, Keynes rightly predicted that the war will help proving his idea right, that public intervention in the economy could be attained by larger public investment. And this was indeed right. Just for clarity, how many more minutes can I have? Sorry. Anyone?
Yes.
How many more minutes can I have?
Ora.
Okay. Okay, I'll just continue. So let's see Keynes again. It's 1 minute.
It is not an exaggeration to say that the end of abnormal unemployment is in sight. And it isn't only the unemployed who will feel the difference. A great number besides will be taking home better money each week. The grand experiment has begun. If it works, if expenditure on armaments really does cure unemployment, I predict that we shall never go back all the way to the old state of affairs. Good may come out of evil. We may learn a trick or two which will come in useful when the day of peace comes.
Indeed, and at least in the US and in England, but especially in the US, the trick was indeed well learned. So now we start concluding. So just to say that during the war, general theory was still read and still used by French economists in their PhD thesis. Even despite great difficulties, they usually would read in English. So because the just the Argentines translation sold out quickly and was unobtainable, but still French economists were able to read in English. There's at least 5 theses written using the PhD, using Keynes's book during the war. So it was already circulating. Here, I must emphasize the role of François Perroux. There's Raphael Febvre in the audience who has just published a very good article on Perroux's role in stimulating the transmission of economic ideas in Vichy France and afterwards. Perroux was not a Keynesian, but he stimulated his students to study Keynes. And he understood that by deparochializing French economics and transferring Anglo-American economics and putting himself forward as an expert on that, that he could survive the épuration and the transition from Vichy to the Fourth Republic. He was in particular responsible for grooming Pierre Roury, who was absolutely fundamental in the introduction of Keynes's national income accounting techniques in France, including the notion of inflationary gap. Now, for the conclusions, just some preliminary conclusions. One is that at least in the first 10 years after Keynes' death in 1946, was that Keynes' impact on the French administration was very, let's say, circumscribed. The second, it's that, which is more relevant probably for our presentation, is about his impact in French economics. And it's most unsurprising from point of view that after Keynes died in 1946, the main French economics journal of the time, the Revue d'économie politique, did not publish an obituary of Keynes. It published an obituary of many other economists who had died during the war, but not of Keynes. And I suppose because obituaries usually presuppose a degree of unanimity on the merits of the deceased, of the dead, but there is no such unanimity regarding Keynes in France. And one could almost talk about the love-hate relationship, but actually it's the same generational gap. The older economists basically continued to dismiss Keynes. The younger ones, even if there was competition from other theories, especially Marxism became increasingly popular, but the younger ones wanted to make sense of Keynes. The famous question that we're still asking today, what did Keynes really mean? And the way to try to understand what did Keynes really meant was to look into the very fast growing literature in Anglo-American, produced by Anglo-American scholars on Keynes. So the Hickses, the Roy Harrods, the Alvin Hansens. And it's one of the conclusions that I make in my research is actually Keynes indirectly contributed to further open up French economics slowly, because it was a very slow process, but it did a contribution nevertheless for an introduction of Anglo-American literature in France. And you start seeing the first textbooks, which include some Keynesian macroeconomics already in 1948 with Jean Marchal, and then the more famous with Raymond Barre and Paul Samos. And I think this is the right time to finish the presentation, because then we start entering not so much the realm of Keynes' ideas, but rather Keynesian theory, which is beyond my remit and my objectives. But again, I would like to emphasize the importance of political context, editorial networks, and academic mobility, and enabling the transfer of Keynes' microeconomics into France during the period that we studied here, the 1930s and the 1940s. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Guilherme, for this nice talk. Thank you very much. We still have 12 minutes for questions. So you can either raise your hand or put just unmute and ask your question or write on the chat. Okay, just check on the chat questions.
May I ask one?
Yes, yes, Dimitrios.
Okay. I'm an economic theorist, so I know nothing about economic history, or very little about economic history. My question is the following. As far as I know,